On certain winter nights, when the wind pressed its pale face against the arrow slits of Windsor and the torches guttered low, there were those among the servants who swore that the castle itself seemed to listen. It was not to the wind that it listened, nor to the restless horses in the stables below. It listened for the king. Henry, sixth of that name, anointed in infancy and crowned before memory had shaped his thoughts, was not fashioned for iron. He had been given a crown before he was given a voice. Those who saw him in the chapel, kneeling longer than was required, thought him devout. Those who watched him in council, silent while men of sharper will sharpen their knives upon words, thought him gentle. They did not see the tremor that moved through him when doors closed too firmly. They did not hear the private litany that haunted his sleep. In the narrow chamber assigned for his nightly rest, the air held the odor of beeswax, damp wool, and extinguished flame. The tapestries along the walls showed saints pierced by arrows and dragons subdued by spears. Their woven eyes stared without blinking. Henry sometimes wondered whether they judged him. He had been taught that kings were God's lieutenants upon earth, yet he felt less a lieutenant than a vessel left too long in a storm. Margaret of Anjou, his queen, moved through the corridors like a blade wrapped in silk. She was young, foreign, and possessed of a mind that did not lower its gaze. Where Henry bowed to uncertainty, Margaret leaned into it. Where he sought mercy, she sought survival. The realm, restless as a horse that scents blood, had begun to test the boundaries of his softness. Factions whispered. Nobles measured one another's strength in banquets and battlefields alike. France, slipping from English grasp, became not merely a territory lost but a wound that would not clot. In council, Margaret's voice did not tremble. It rang clear against the stone, steady as a bell in frost. Some said she spoke for the king, others said she spoke over him. There were moments, brief and quickly buried, when Henry would look upon her profile, lit by the amber glow of torches, and feel not love nor hatred but a child's confusion before a stern mother. In her certainty, he sensed accusation. In her resolve, he felt exposed. Fear, when it enters a crown, does not announce itself with trumpets. It comes quietly, like mildew beneath embroidered hems. The king's fear was not of death. Death, to him, was a gate kept by angels. He had long ago reconciled himself to the thought that his life belonged not to his own pulse but to Providence. Rather, he feared judgment in the eyes of the living. He feared the sharp intelligence of Margaret, who understood power as a current to be directed, not endured. He feared that in her gaze he was weighed and found insufficient. At night, when the castle exhaled and the torches dwindled to coals, he would rise from his bed and walk barefoot upon the cold rushes. The chill steadied him. Through a slit of window he would glimpse the moon caught in mist above the Thames, pale as a wafer. He would whisper prayers not for victory but for quiet. The Latin syllables trembled on his tongue, tasting faintly of wine and ash. There were times when Margaret entered without herald. The scent of foreign oils clung to her, orange blossom and something sharper beneath, like crushed rosemary. She would stand near the hearth, observing him as one might observe a falcon that refuses to hunt. Her words were measured. She spoke of alliances, of men who must be rewarded or restrained, of letters from Calais heavy with warning. He listened, nodding, fingers folded within his sleeves. To outsiders, theirs was a marriage of strategy. To Henry, it was a mirror he could not bear to look into for long. He had been a child who preferred psalms to swords. Even now, in manhood, the clang of steel unsettled his bones. He believed in mercy as others believed in fortifications. Yet mercy, unguarded, invites wolves. Margaret understood wolves. She had grown among them. One evening, after a council that ended in raised voices and the dull scrape of chairs, Henry remained seated long after the chamber emptied. The candles sputtered, wax pooled like pale tears upon the table. He pressed his palms against the wood and felt its grain, rough and real. Outside, somewhere in the lower bailey, a dog howled. The sound carried upward, thin and aching. Is a king free? He asked no one. The question hovered in the smoke. Freedom, he had been taught, belonged to those who commanded. Yet he felt bound, by expectation, by blood, by the relentless gaze of history. A peasant might flee into forest or sea. A king is anchored to his throne as surely as a martyr to his stake. When Margaret returned that night, she found him not in bed but kneeling before the small crucifix near the hearth. The fire had dwindled to embers, painting his face in bruised hues of red and shadow. He did not turn when she entered. "England requires strength," she said softly. He closed his eyes. "England requires peace." "Peace," she replied, "is a thing won, not wished." Her words were not cruel. They were certain. And certainty, to a man who doubts himself, can feel like a blade laid gently against the throat. In the months that followed, whispers grew teeth. The court divided into subtle camps, each professing loyalty while calculating advantage. Margaret moved with increasing authority. Letters bore her influence, decisions carried her imprint. Henry signed where he was guided to sign. He told himself that unity was better than discord, that a divided crown would shatter entirely. Yet at times he would wake before dawn, heart racing, certain he had heard his own name spoken in a tone not of reverence but of scorn. The darkness pressed close, thick with the scent of cold stone and dying embers. In such moments he felt the vastness of time stretching behind and before him, kings buried beneath cathedral floors, their bones indistinguishable from those of common men. Time, he reflected, is the true sovereign. It humbles conquerors and consoles the forgotten. Before it, fear and courage are equally brief. Margaret did not see his private terrors, or if she saw them, she named them differently. To her, his hesitation was not fear but frailty. And frailty, in an age sharpened by war, is perilous. Thus the king who had been crowned to embody divine order found himself shrinking within the echoing halls of his own dominion. He feared not rebellion, nor the clash of armies, but the steady, unyielding will of the woman beside him. In her presence he felt the weight of his own inadequacy as one feels the weight of damp wool upon the shoulders, inescapable, chilling, intimate. It is said that the soul seeks light. Yet there are souls that, overwhelmed by brightness, retreat into shadow for shelter. On that winter's night, as snow began to gather along the battlements and the bells of the chapel tolled Compline, Henry lay awake listening to the slow breathing of the castle. He imagined the future as a corridor without torches. Somewhere within it, footsteps approached, firm, unhesitating. And the king, anointed by God yet uncertain of himself, understood with a clarity that tasted of iron, the gravest prisons are not built of stone. They are fashioned of doubt, and sometimes, of love. Spring arrived reluctantly, as though unsure it was welcome within walls so accustomed to vigilance. In the inner garden, where laurel shrubs had once been planted to signify endurance, new shoots pressed through soil still sour with winter rot. The air carried the mingled scents of thawing earth, damp stone, and the faint sweetness of early blossoms. Yet even here, beneath an open sky, the king did not feel enlarged. Henry walked among the narrow paths at dawn, before courtiers stirred and before Margaret's attendants drew back her curtains. The gravel whispered beneath his steps. A thin mist hovered above the ground, veiling the statues of forgotten saints whose noses had been worn smooth by centuries of weather. He paused before one such figure and traced the eroded face with his eyes. Time, he thought, is a patient sculptor. It does not rage. It does not plead. It simply removes. In recent weeks, Margaret's presence had expanded beyond chamber and council. She convened men in private alcoves. She wrote letters sealed not only with the royal signet but with her own insistence. The courtiers had begun to bow to her with a subtle difference, less courtesy, more calculation. It was as though they sensed in her a flame that might warm or consume. Henry observed these shifts as one observes weather gathering at sea. He lacked the instinct to command storms. Instead, he prayed they might pass without wreckage. Rumors of unrest in the shires reached him in fragments, a skirmish here, a grievance there, the name of a duke spoken too loudly in taverns. The realm was restless, its loyalties braided loosely. Margaret spoke of necessary firmness. She named men who must be disciplined, estates that must be reclaimed, alliances forged with sharper edges. Mercy invites contempt, she told him one afternoon as they stood overlooking the Thames, its waters swollen and brown from spring rain. Henry watched the current slide past the battlements. And severity invites hatred. She regarded him steadily. The wind tugged at the dark veil framing her face. Hatred may be endured. Weakness cannot. There was no cruelty in her tone, only conviction. Yet conviction, when unshared, becomes a wall. That evening, in the great hall, a feast was held for envoys newly arrived from the north. The hall blazed with torchlight. The scent of roasted venison mingled with spilled ale and the musk of damp cloaks. Laughter rose and fell like surf against stone. Musicians plucked at strings, their melodies bright but thin against the cavernous ceiling. Henry sat at the high table beside Margaret. The gold threads in her gown caught the firelight, scattering it like fragments of sun. She spoke with the envoys in measured tones, her questions precise. Henry answered when addressed, his voice gentle, almost diffident. More than once he felt her glance flick toward him, not reproachful, not tender, but assessing. Across the hall, nobles leaned close to one another, murmuring behind raised cups. The king sensed in their lowered eyes a silent arithmetic: who commands, who hesitates, who will prevail. He tasted little of the food placed before him. The venison lay heavy, scented with cloves. Wine warmed his throat but did not steady his heart. Beneath the table, his fingers tightened against the carved arm of his chair, tracing the grooves worn by generations of sovereign hands. In that moment, surrounded by noise and light, he felt profoundly alone. Isolation within a crowd is a peculiar affliction. It is not the absence of bodies but the absence of understanding. Henry's faith, which had once been a lantern, now flickered uncertainly. He believed that God ordained all stations, king and beggar alike. Yet he could not discern whether his own trials were chastisement or design. Late that night, long after the envoys had been escorted to their chambers, he wandered again to the chapel. The stone floor retained the day's chill. Candles guttered before the altar, their smoke curling upward in thin, wavering lines. He knelt. "Grant me clarity," he whispered. But clarity is rarely bestowed upon those who fear what it may reveal. In the days that followed, Margaret pressed for the removal of certain advisers whose loyalty she doubted. Henry resisted weakly, suggesting patience, reconciliation, prayer. She countered with reports of plots, of whispered oaths sworn in shadowed corridors. Whether these dangers were imminent or merely possible mattered little. In turbulent times, possibility can wield as much force as fact. Thus decisions were made. A trusted counselor was dismissed. Another was confined to his estate under quiet guard. The court shifted, like sand rearranged by an unseen tide. Henry affixed his seal where Margaret indicated. Each impression of wax felt to him like the soft closing of a door. He began to dream of corridors without end. In these dreams, he walked alone, candle in hand, while distant footsteps echoed behind him. When he turned, he saw not enemies but Margaret, her face unreadable, her gaze unwavering. He would wake with the taste of smoke upon his tongue and the echo of bells in his ears. Death did not terrify him. He had contemplated it often, not morbidly but as one contemplates the horizon. Death, he believed, was a surrender into divine order. What unsettled him was the slow erosion of self that precedes it, the subtle yielding of will, the quiet relinquishing of voice. Freedom, he began to suspect, is not the absence of chains but the courage to bear consequence. And courage was a garment that hung awkwardly upon his shoulders. One morning, as sunlight finally pierced the clouds and illuminated the garden in a pale wash of gold, Henry observed Margaret from a distance. She stood among the laurels, speaking to a cluster of lords. Her posture was straight, her gestures controlled. The men inclined toward her, attentive. For a fleeting instant, he felt not fear but admiration. She possessed what he lacked: decisiveness, heat, an instinct for survival sharpened by youth and exile. Yet admiration does not erase displacement. The laurel leaves stirred in the breeze, their glossy surfaces flashing like small mirrors. Henry recalled that laurels symbolized victory. Yet here they seemed brittle, their edges tinged with brown. Victory, he reflected, often withers at its root. As the bells tolled terse, he turned away from the garden and returned to the dim corridors within. The castle swallowed him in its familiar coolness. Somewhere distant, a door shut with measured finality. Thus the king continued, crowned yet constrained, married yet solitary, while the realm shifted subtly beneath his feet. And like the laurel that survives winter only to lose its luster in spring, he endured, uncertain whether endurance itself was virtue or merely postponement. For in the quiet arithmetic of power, even love may become a ledger of debts. There came a summer so heavy with heat that even the crows fell silent upon the battlements. The air lay over the kingdom like damp wool, suffocating and intimate. Reports arrived thick as flies: rebellion in the shires, unrest among soldiers unpaid, a duke whose ambition had ripened beyond discretion. Names once spoken with courtesy were now uttered with guarded caution. The realm no longer trembled in whispers, it stirred openly. and the king began to withdraw. At first it was subtle. He paused longer before answering. His gaze drifted toward windows as though something beyond the glass summoned him. During council, while Margaret and the lords debated troop movements and levies, Henry's fingers would move soundlessly over the beads of a rosary hidden within his sleeve. Then, one afternoon, as voices rose around him, sharp, insistent, overlapping like clashing steel, he simply ceased to respond. A question was placed before him regarding the mustering of forces. He did not blink. Another was asked, more urgently. He remained still. The chamber quieted by degrees, as though sound itself feared to intrude upon whatever had taken hold of him. His eyes were open, yet they seemed fixed upon some interior horizon none other could perceive. Thus began the year without a voice. Physicians were summoned. They burned herbs whose bitter smoke clung to tapestries and hair alike. They pressed cool cloths to his brow, whispered of imbalances in humors, of melancholy too long indulged. Priests chanted litanies. Margaret stood beside the bed, her composure unfractured, though her knuckles whitened where they clasped the bedpost. Henry lay unmoving. He ate when fed, drank when prompted, but offered no word. His body remained, his will had retreated beyond reach. In the corridors, fear thickened. A silent king is more perilous than an angry one. Authority abhors vacancy. Factions, sensing opportunity, gathered like wolves scenting an unguarded fold. Margaret did not weep publicly. She assumed command with a steadiness that bordered on severity. Orders were issued in the king's name. Seals were impressed. Armies were repositioned. If grief visited her, it did so in private hours when even her attendants slept. Some said the king had been struck by divine vision. Others murmured of sorcery, of a mind too fragile for the burden of crown. The truth lay quieter and more human. For Henry, the world had grown unbearably loud. Within the chamber where he lay, the smell of lavender attempted to mask the odor of illness and stale linen. Flies traced lazy circles near the window. Outside, summer storms gathered and broke, rain striking stone with a rhythm that might once have soothed him. Inside his unmoving form, however, thought did not cease. He drifted through memories, a childhood cloistered in tutor's chambers, the echo of Latin psalms beneath cathedral vaults, the first time he saw Margaret, radiant and resolute, her youth like a banner against grey stone. He remembered believing that gentleness could redeem severity, that piety might temper ambition. Now those beliefs seemed distant, like bells heard across water. What is a king, he wondered in that interior silence, when stripped of speech? Is he still sovereign if he cannot command even his own tongue? Time moved differently for him. Days blurred into one another, indistinguishable but for the angle of light across the floor. Dust motes floated like constellations in miniature. He studied them with detached curiosity, as though observing the slow dance of souls. Death hovered not as threat but as companion. He felt its nearness without dread. Death promised release from decision, from expectation, from the relentless scrutiny of living eyes. Yet it did not claim him. Instead, he remained suspended, neither fully present nor fully absent. Margaret visited daily. She spoke to him of the realm's needs, of victories narrowly secured, of betrayals uncovered. Her voice, though controlled, carried an undercurrent of urgency. She would pause, as if awaiting response, then continue when none came. Once, believing him insensible, she allowed her hand to rest lightly upon his. The gesture was brief. He felt it. Beneath her composure lay exhaustion. Beneath her certainty, fear. For power seized in necessity is never entirely secure. Each decree she issued in his stead deepened both her authority and her isolation. Allies obeyed, rivals watched. The birth of their son brought a fleeting brightness to the dim chamber. The infant's cry pierced the stillness like a blade of light. Margaret placed the child in Henry's arms. For a moment, no longer than the flicker of a candle, his eyes focused. They traced the fragile curve of cheek, the minute rise and fall of breath. A tremor passed through him. Witnesses would later swear that he smiled. Yet no word followed. Outside the castle walls, the kingdom edged closer to fracture. Loyalty shifted with alarming ease. The absence at the center became a void others sought to fill. Ambition sharpened. Oaths grew conditional. Freedom, in such times, reveals its paradox. Those who grasp for it often bind themselves to violence. Those who relinquish it may preserve their souls but lose their crowns. Henry's silence became legend before it ended. Some interpreted it as saintly withdrawal, a retreat into divine communion. Others saw it as proof of unfitness. In truth, it was the mind's last defense against unbearable dissonance. When at last he stirred, after months measured by the waxing and waning of moons, it was with the tentative fragility of one returning from distant shores. His lips parted. Sound emerged, thin and uncertain. The first word he spoke was not of war nor governance. It was the child's name. Those present wept with relief. Margaret did not. She watched him carefully, as one assesses a structure after fire, grateful it stands, uncertain of its strength. The year without a voice had altered more than the king. It had rearranged the kingdom's balance. Authority once assumed had been tested and tasted by other hands. And though Henry had returned to speech, something within him remained fractured, like a bell cracked by unseen force, capable still of ringing, yet never again with its former clarity. Thus the silence ended, but its echo endured. Autumn came early that year, as if impatient with the fragile warmth of reconciliation. The leaves along the Thames yellowed and fell before their time, gathering in damp clusters against the castle walls. The wind acquired an edge. It moved through corridors with a sound like distant whispering, slipping beneath doors and stirring the hems of garments. Those who had lived long at court recognized the sensation. Change had crossed the threshold and would not be turned away. Henry resumed his seat in council, but he did not resume himself. His speech had returned, yet it bore a hesitancy not easily concealed. Words emerged as though tested for safety before release. When disputes flared between rival lords, he sought compromise with almost desperate tenderness, as a physician might attempt to bind a wound too wide for stitching. Margaret, seated beside him, had grown accustomed to command. Her posture no longer suggested guardianship alone but proprietorship. During the king's silence she had negotiated treaties, fortified alliances, and issued directives with an authority that did not require apology. The realm had seen her strength, some had come to depend upon it. Now that Henry spoke again, the question lingered unvoiced in every chamber: who truly ruled? The answer shifted from hour to hour. In private, their conversations lengthened and hardened. The chamber that had once held restrained politeness now bore the weight of accumulated restraint. The hearth crackled between them as though translating what neither wished to say plainly. "You must show resolve," Margaret insisted one evening, pacing slowly before the narrow window. Outside, rain streaked the glass in restless lines. "They test you because you permit testing." Henry stood near the crucifix, fingers folded. "They test because they fear. Then give them reason to fear you more." He looked at her fully then. In the dim firelight her face appeared both beautiful and severe, youth sharpened by endurance. He saw not an adversary but a woman who had fought ceaselessly against the erosion of her husband's authority, and, in doing so, had claimed portions of it for herself. "Must fear be the foundation of rule?" he asked quietly. "In times such as these," she replied, "it is the mortar." Outside the castle, the realm's fractures widened. The ambitions of powerful dukes no longer hid beneath ceremony. Allegiances formed like storm fronts across the country. Men armed themselves not only with swords but with narratives, each proclaiming loyalty to England while defining it differently. Henry felt the kingdom slipping into multiplicity. One England spoke through Margaret's decisiveness. Another murmured through rebellious lords. A third lingered in chapels and fields, where common folk desired only harvest without conscription, prayer without blood. He belonged most fully to the third. Yet he wore the crown of the first. In the great hall, banners hung heavy and unmoving in the stagnant air. Colors that once symbolized unity now signified factions. Henry studied them as though they were wounds stitched poorly together. The scent of tallow candles mingled with the metallic tang of armor newly polished. Courtiers bowed deeply, but beneath their lowered gazes calculations flickered. Margaret moved through this atmosphere with controlled intensity. She met glances directly, measured responses swiftly, allowed no tremor to betray fatigue. Yet solitude, when it found her, was no kinder than it had been to Henry. Power isolates. Those who exercise it cannot fully trust affection, those who lack it cannot fully relinquish envy. Thus husband and wife stood upon the same dais yet inhabited different climates of loneliness. One night, After a messenger arrived breathless from the north with news of open defiance, Henry withdrew to the chapel alone. The hour was late. Candles burned low, their flames bending in unseen draughts. The scent of cold stone and old incense enveloped him. He knelt, but prayer did not come. Instead, he contemplated the shape of death, not his own, but that of the realm. Kingdoms, like men, are mortal. They are born of conquest, sustained by agreement, undone by excess or neglect. He wondered whether England now suffered from both. Time pressed upon him with unfamiliar urgency. He was no longer the uncertain youth nor the silent invalid. He was a father. The image of his son, small hands curling instinctively around offered fingers, rose before him with painful clarity. What inheritance does a fractured crown bestow? He wondered. In that quiet chapel he confronted a thought he had long resisted, that love, unguided by strength, may invite ruin, yet strength untempered by love may produce tyranny. Between these extremes he had faltered. Margaret entered softly, her steps echoing faintly. For a moment they knelt side by side without speaking. The shared silence was different from the silence of his illness. It was charged, almost tender. "Our enemies gather," she said at last, not unkindly. "I know. Then we must gather as well." He turned toward her. In her eyes he glimpsed not accusation but weariness. The lines at their corners had deepened. She too had paid for every decision. "Have I failed you?" he asked. The question lingered like incense smoke. "You have been yourself," she answered carefully. "The world is less forgiving than you are." It was neither absolution nor condemnation. Winter threatened again. Supplies were counted. Messengers rode ceaselessly. The castle thrummed with preparation. Armor was inspected, oaths renewed. The clang of metal rang through courtyards where children had once played at mock battle. Henry forced himself to preside over councils with firmer tone. He signed decrees with steadier hand. Yet beneath these gestures lay the awareness that authority reclaimed by effort alone lacks the effortless gravity of conviction. Margaret watched, neither obstructing nor yielding entirely. Between them stretched a fragile accord, two wills attempting alignment while aware of their divergence. In quiet moments, Henry sensed that his fear of her had transformed. It was no longer the fear of judgment alone, but the fear of becoming unnecessary. She had proven capable without him. The realm had witnessed it. And still, when night deepened and the wind pressed once more against stone, he would lie awake listening to the castle breathe. The scent of smoke clung to the curtains. Somewhere a sentry coughed, the sound small against the vast dark. He understood then that crowns do not divide cleanly. They fracture internally, along lines invisible to subjects but keenly felt by those who bear them. Husband and wife, mercy and severity, faith and expedience, each pair a fault line beneath the gold. Autumn leaves rotted into the earth. Frost silvered the battlements. The kingdom edged closer to open conflict, though no trumpet had yet declared it so. And within the royal chamber, two sovereigns, bound by marriage, separated by temperament, prepared in their separate ways for a storm neither could fully command. For when fear is shared but not confessed, it becomes destiny. The storm, when it came, did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived in the form of standards raised against standards, of colors unfurled beneath a sky the color of unpolished steel. Frost clung stubbornly to the grass at dawn, and the breath of men and horses mingled in pale clouds that drifted and vanished. Armor creaked. Leather straps were tightened with hands that trembled not always from cold. War, which had long hovered as rumor, now possessed weight and sound. Henry rode at the head of his retinue, though the horse beneath him seemed more certain of its purpose than its rider. The animal's flanks were warm against his boots, its steady heartbeat traveled upward through saddle and bone. Around him banners snapped sharply in the wind, red, white, emblems embroidered with lions and roses that would soon be stained beyond recognition. Margaret was not beside him. She had remained where strategy required, orchestrating movements with a clarity sharpened by necessity. Yet her absence rode with him like a second shadow. He knew that even in distance her will extended across the field, measured and unyielding. The plain stretched wide and indifferent. Frost gave way beneath trampling feet, releasing the scent of crushed grass and damp earth. Crows circled overhead, patient arbiters of consequence. Henry surveyed the opposing ranks. Faces were indistinct at such distance, only glints of metal and the restless shifting of men awaiting signal. Somewhere among them stood those who claimed loyalty to England as fervently as he did, though their allegiance rejected his right to embody it. How fragile, he thought, is the thread that binds obedience to belief. Trumpets sounded. The first clash was less a roar than a collision of breath and iron. Steel met steel with a ringing violence that seemed to fracture the air itself. Horses screamed, high, terrible sounds rarely heard beyond slaughterhouses. The ground shuddered beneath the charge. Henry's sword felt foreign in his hand. He had practiced, as kings must, yet practice bears little resemblance to flesh yielding under force. When the first body fell near him, blood seeping darkly into frost-whitened grass, he inhaled sharply. The metallic scent rose warm and immediate, mingling with mud and sweat. Time altered. Moments stretched, then snapped. Shouts blurred into a single sustained cry. A man stumbled before him, eyes wide not with hatred but with astonishment, as though surprised that death had chosen his name. Henry raised his blade almost reflexively. The motion was clumsy, insufficiently angled. Another soldier intervened, the men fell regardless. Thus the king participated in violence without mastery of it. Around him, banners dipped and rose again. The emblem of a rival house wavered, then collapsed into the churned earth. Cheers erupted, quickly swallowed by fresh conflict. Mud thickened beneath boots, pulling at movement like reluctant hands. Henry felt neither exhilaration nor fury. Only a profound sorrow, expanding within him with each cry cut short. These were not abstract adversaries but fathers, sons, believers in causes not wholly corrupt. He wondered whether God observed such fields with grief or detachment. At midday, clouds parted briefly, casting a cold illumination upon the carnage. Bodies lay contorted in unnatural repose. Broken lances protruded from the ground like saplings stripped of bark. The frost had melted entirely, replaced by mud-streaked red. A messenger forced his way through the chaos to reach the king. His face was smeared with dirt and something darker. "Your Grace, the left flank yields, but the center holds." Henry nodded, though the words seemed distant. He issued instructions as rehearsed, voice steadier than his pulse. Orders traveled outward, carried by riders whose expressions betrayed exhaustion beyond their years. In that hour he understood something with piercing clarity: authority in battle is less about courage than about endurance. To remain mounted while others fall, to continue issuing commands while fear gnaws at marrow, that is its own brutality. As the afternoon waned, the tide shifted. Victory, or something resembling it, tilted uncertainly toward his standard. Opposing forces began to withdraw, not in noble retreat but in fractured dispersal. The field did not cheer, it exhaled. When silence finally descended, it did so reluctantly. The cries of the wounded replaced the clangor of steel. They were softer sounds, yet more difficult to bear. Men called for mothers, for saints, for water. Some whispered apologies to wives who would never hear them. The scent of open bodies thickened in the cooling air. Henry dismounted. His boots sank into mud that no longer felt like earth but like consequence. He walked among the fallen without escort, ignoring attempts to restrain him. A soldier lay clutching a torn banner, its emblem soaked beyond recognition. The man's lips moved soundlessly. Henry knelt and offered water. It spilled down the soldier's chin, mingling with blood. The king murmured a prayer, though he could not tell whether it was for the dying men or for himself. Victory was declared before nightfall. The words sounded hollow. Fires were lit along the perimeter of the field. Smoke rose in slow spirals, carrying with it the odor of scorched cloth and flesh. The sky darkened to indigo. Stars emerged, indifferent witnesses. Henry stood apart, helmet removed, hair damp against his brow. His hands trembled now that action had ceased. In the distance, he saw figures moving methodically among the dead, identifying, collecting, stripping. He felt no triumph. Instead, he sensed the irreversible nature of what had occurred. Blood once spilled cannot be summoned back into veins. Trust once severed rarely mends without scar. Margaret's envoys would carry news of success. They would speak of strength demonstrated, of rebellion subdued. They would not speak of the young soldier whose final breath had warmed Henry's gloved hand. Night deepened. He thought of his son, small, uncomprehending, destined perhaps to inherit not peace but precedent. What example had he offered? A king who feared his queen, then feared his own silence, and now feared the cost of his awakening. Death on the field had been swift for some, agonizing for others. Yet all alike surrendered to the same quiet earth. Titles dissolved beneath soil as readily as anonymity. Time, that patient sovereign, would level even this day. But before time could soften memory, Henry felt the imprint of each fallen body upon his conscience. He understood that war does not merely claim lives, it alters the interior architecture of those who survive it. When at last he returned to his tent, the canvas walls flickering with firelight, he removed his gauntlets slowly. His hands bore smears not entirely his own. He studied them as though they belonged to a stranger. In seeking to preserve his crown, he had consented to the breaking of countless others. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying away the last echoes of battle. Within, the king bowed his head, not in victory, but in mourning. For on that field where banners fell, something within him fell as well, the final illusion that power might be exercised without inheritance of guilt. Winter did not wait for consent. It settled over the kingdom with a stillness that felt almost merciful after the violence of men. Frost sealed the fields where battle had raged. Snow softened the churned earth, covering scars with deceptive purity. Rivers slowed beneath thin crusts of ice. Even the crows, glutted and watchful, grew sparse against the pale sky. But within stone walls, consequences endured. Victory had not secured peace, it had only postponed another reckoning. Alliances shifted again, as alliances always do when purchased with blood. Those who had cheered the king's firmness now questioned its cost. Those who had doubted him searched for new grounds upon which to stand. Henry felt the weight of triumph as one feels the weight of wet wool, heavy, cold, inescapable. He no longer feared Margaret in the manner he once had. Fear had matured into something quieter and more complex. He saw now the burden she had carried during his silence, the iron she had forced into her own spirit to compensate for his absence. Yet between them remained a distance neither apology nor shared memory could wholly bridge. Power had altered them both. In the great chamber, before assembled lords, they appeared united. Their son stood between them on ceremonial occasions, small fingers grasping fabric embroidered with symbols older than his understanding. The court observed this tableau with cautious relief. A lineage embodied reassurance. Yet lineage is not certainty. On certain evenings Henry would withdraw alone to a narrow tower room rarely visited by others. The chamber smelled of cold stone and extinguished fire. From its window he could see the river winding like dull silver through winter fields. The wind there was sharper, unobstructed by walls. He found himself reflecting not upon battles but upon time. He had once believed time to be a distant horizon. Now he felt it at his shoulder. Time had taken his illusions gently at first, then without negotiation. It had shown him that mercy without structure falters, that strength without tenderness corrodes, that love cannot prevent destiny but may suffer because of it. He considered death again, not as escape but as inevitability. Death would come whether he ruled wisely or poorly, whether England prospered or fractured. The earth would accept him without regard for titles. Beneath cathedral stone or common soil, bone becomes bone. What, then, endures? Not banners. Not decrees sealed in wax. Perhaps only the manner in which one bore the weight entrusted to him. Margaret joined him in that tower once, unannounced. Snow drifted lightly beyond the window, its descent silent and unwavering. She stood beside him without speaking, her presence no longer blade-like but subdued, tempered by years of vigilance. "We have survived," she said at last. He nodded. For now. There was no bitterness in his tone, only recognition. They stood together, watching the snow erase distinctions upon the earth below. Fields that had belonged to rival houses appeared indistinguishable beneath white. Boundaries dissolved temporarily in cold. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "The firmness? The blood?" Margaret did not answer at once. Her breath clouded faintly in the chill. "I regret necessity," she said finally. "But I do not regret protecting what is ours." He studied her profile, older now, though not yet aged. The certainty that once unsettled him had softened into something like resolve without sharpness. "I feared you," he confessed. She turned to him, surprised not by accusation but by honesty. "And I feared losing everything," she replied. In that exchange lay the simple architecture of their tragedy, fear answering fear, each misunderstood as opposition rather than kinship. The bells of the chapel began to toll vespers, their sound traveling upward through stone. It was a sound unchanged by war, by ambition, by human frailty. The rhythm persisted as it had for generations before them and would for generations after. Henry felt no sudden revelation, no absolution descending like light through stained glass. Instead, he felt acceptance, thin but steady. He had not been the king England required in its fiercest hour, nor entirely the failure his enemies proclaimed. He had been a man shaped for gentleness thrust into severity. He had faltered. He had endured. He had acted too late and sometimes too reluctantly. Yet he had loved, awkwardly, fearfully, imperfectly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering battlements, softening angles, silencing footfalls. The world seemed briefly at peace, though beneath the white the ground remained scarred. Time would move again. It would unsettle their son, test the realm anew, erode their names into lines within chronicles read by distant eyes. Perhaps, centuries hence, a solitary reader would consider the king who feared his queen and judge him weak. But weakness is often only unguarded conscience. As night closed fully around the tower, Henry reached for Margaret's hand, not in dependence, not in surrender, but in shared mortality. She allowed it. The crown rested elsewhere, heavy upon velvet. Here, in the quiet after ambition, after silence, after battle, they stood simply as two souls who had navigated power and been altered by it. The bells ceased. And in the hush that followed, the king understood at last: authority fades, fear transforms, even love wounds, yet the dignity with which one bears his portion of time is the only sovereignty death cannot strip away. Snow fell through darkness, patient and impartial, until the castle itself seemed less fortress than monument. Thus ended not a reign, nor a conflict, but an illusion. And in its place remained something quieter, more human, and therefore more enduring.